Welcome to Right Now. By the time you finish hearing this, the global financial system has already executed thousands of transactions without a single visible human decision at the surface level. Not because humans are absent, but because their role has been gradually abstracted into systems that operate faster than interpretation itself. And this is the first thing most people fail to understand about modern finance. Control has not disappeared, it has migrated. And what it has migrated into is a layered structure of algorithms, institutions, and regulatory frameworks that interact in real time, constantly adjusting capital flows based on risk models that do not sleep, do not hesitate, and do not interpret meaning the way humans do. They interpret only probability, exposure, correlation, and systemic stability. Within this shift, something fundamental changes in the nature of economic reality, because when decision-making is delegated to systems that optimize for efficiency, the role of human intention begins to shrink into predefined corridors of possibility. Inside those corridors, choice still exists, but only as a function of what the system permits. And this is where the modern financial landscape quietly diverges from traditional narratives, because while the public conversation still revolves around whether digital assets are speculative or legitimate, institutional actors have already moved into a different conceptual phase. These assets are no longer treated as ideological instruments, but as structural components within global risk architecture. This is the point where misunderstanding becomes dangerous, because what looks like adoption from the outside is actually integration from the inside, meaning systems are not simply accepting new assets, they are reorganizing themselves around them. And this reorganization is driven not by belief, but by necessity, specifically the necessity created by game-theoretic pressure. In competitive financial environments, ignoring a new asset class does not protect you from risk. It often increases your exposure to it. And this is why institutions that once dismissed digital currencies as irrelevant are now analyzing them within formal portfolio frameworks, not because they have changed their philosophy, but because the structure of incentives no longer allows them to ignore what others are doing. Once embedding begins, the system does not return to its previous state. It evolves forward, not backward. And ownership itself begins to shift from a static legal concept into a conditional computational state, meaning that what you own is increasingly defined not only by law, but also by the operational rules of the system that records it. This subtle shift is often invisible at first because it appears as optimization, efficiency, modernization, but these words mask the structural depth of what is happening. Compliance is no longer external, it is embedded, it is internal, and when enforcement becomes internal, the distinction between policy and execution begins to blur. Right now, the transformation we are describing does not remain at the level of abstract theory, because at the institutional level, it is already operational. And once a system becomes operational, it stops being a prediction and it becomes an environment. Meaning it no longer asks whether participants agree with it, it simply structures the conditions under which participation is possible. And this is where large-scale financial institutions enter the picture, not as passive observers, but as active architects of capital flow. In a global system where trillions of dollars move across borders in milliseconds, the primary constraint is no longer access to information, it is the ability to process that information in real time. This is why advanced risk systems have become central, systems that aggregate data across markets, geopolitical events, and macroeconomic indicators, transforming all of it into probabilistic models of exposure. These platforms do not just reflect the market, they help define the boundaries within which market behavior is interpreted. This creates a subtle but powerful feedback loop where perception and execution begin to merge, because when enough capital is allocated based on similar models,
Those models begin to shape the very behavior they're designed to measure. And within this environment, institutions that once treated digital assets as marginal begin to reevaluate them, not because of ideological change, but because of structural necessity. Since ignoring a new asset class in a highly interconnected system introduces asymmetry, and asymmetry in financial systems translates directly into risk exposure. Traditional frameworks are showing structural limitations. The classical balance between equities and bonds, designed for environments that no longer exist. Today, correlations shift rapidly under stress, and when correlations break down, diversification behaves differently than expected. This forces institutions to search for additional hedging mechanisms. This is where digital instruments enter formal discussions, not as speculative instruments, but as potential macro hedging components. This transition is reinforced by AI-driven analytics. Systems that aggregate global exposure are not neutral calculators. They are adaptive frameworks. They increasingly incorporate non-traditional data streams, on-chain activity, network liquidity flows, behavioral indicators, meaning that what was once outside the perimeter is now being absorbed into the core. This absorption is gradual but persistent, a slow convergence between traditional finance and decentralized infrastructure. It's happening through incremental integration, where each step appears small in isolation, but significant in aggregate. Assets are no longer categorized by origin, but by function, liquidity, systemic impact, and this transition leads directly into the next layer of the system, where money, assets, and identity begin to converge under a unified digital infrastructure. And as we move deeper into the structure of modern finance, another layer begins to emerge, one that is even more fundamental than asset allocation or risk models, because this layer does not only redefine how value moves, it begins to redefine what value actually is. This is where central bank digital currencies enter the picture, not as a futuristic concept, but as an ongoing development within systems already under pressure. Debt expansion, inflation volatility, complexity. But the real transformation lies not in digitization itself, but in programmability, meaning that money is no longer a neutral medium of exchange. It is a structured instrument. It can carry embedded rules, conditions, behavioral constraints. Value itself can be designed to behave in specific ways under specific conditions. This is a structural shift in the history of money, with no historical equivalent. And as this concept develops, it connects directly to tokenization. Real-world assets, real estate, equities, commodities, all represented as digital tokens, moving across markets in near real time. But beneath this efficiency narrative, there is a deeper transformation occurring. When assets are converted into programmable units, ownership becomes dependent on the infrastructure. Ownership is no longer purely a legal abstraction enforced by courts. It becomes a hybrid construct, a computational state. This introduces a new concept, conditional ownership. Access to an asset is no longer determined only by possession, but by compliance with the rules of the system. This is where CBDCs and tokenization converge into a unified financial architecture, because whoever defines the rules of the system effectively defines the boundaries of ownership within it. This leads to a fundamental question: who controls the protocol layer? The distinction between financial infrastructure and governance begins to blur. Code, regulation, and institutional design merge into a single operating environment. Traditional concepts like custody and possession are being reinterpreted through digital mechanisms. This transition is gradual but continuous, always active, always connected, always updating. And this is where the next stage of the narrative begins, where artificial intelligence, quantum computation, and global infrastructure start to interact, producing a level of complexity that challenges traditional notions of control, predictability, and even ownership itself. And now we move into the second layer of this evolving structure, where the idea of money stops being just a medium of exchange and starts becoming a mechanism of behavior design. Because once value becomes programmable, the next logical step is not only to define how money moves, but also under what conditions it is allowed to move. This is where central bank digital currencies represent a structural shift. Unlike traditional cash, programmable money introduces the ability to embed rules directly into the asset itself. This fundamentally changes the relationship between the individual and the system. Compliance is no longer a separate process. It is an intrinsic property of the transaction. Control becomes more subtle. It is not about denying access